Who's to blame for high property taxes in Illinois? A report from the Cook County Treasurer's Office set off a war of words and finger pointing across the political spectrum this week. From Capital News, Illinois, it's Friday, April 3rd, 2026. We'll look at the facts behind all the accusations on this edition of Capital Cast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Cast. I'm Peter Hancock and I'm here again this week with my colleagues Ben Szalinski and Brenden Moore, and we're talking about everyone's favorite subject, property taxes. The Cook County Treasurer's Office created a stir this week when that office issued a report detailing why property taxes in the state's most populous county seem to be rising out of control. The report came out just ahead of the April 1st deadline for Cook County property owners to pay their first installment on their 2025 tax bills. In other counties, the due date is later, so don't panic if you missed it. The report noted that over the last 30 years, property taxes there have risen at twice the rate of inflation and faster than growth in personal wages. And while the report was specific to Cook County, it clearly touched a nerve with everyone else in Illinois. That's because by almost any measure, Illinois has among the highest, if not the highest, property taxes in the nation. And that's not just in Cook County. So who's responsible for everyone's rising property tax bills? Governor J.B. Pritzker was asked about that during a media gaggle in Chicago on Monday. He put the blame on school districts for raising property taxes despite getting increased funding from the state.
One of the purposes of that is to alleviate the burden on local governments, on local school boards, and on people who are paying property taxes locally. But you know what? School boards didn't take the hint. And so they've continued to ratchet up property taxes over and over and over again. And that has led to a continued very high property tax burden on homeowners across the state.
Republicans wasted no time responding to that comment. Here's House Minority Leader Tony McCombie, a Savannah Republican, speaking to reporters on Wednesday.
But our local school boards are to blame? I don't think so, Governor. And over the last decade, there have been several task forces that many of you have reported on, supposedly working on property taxes. And yet here we are, no real relief, no structural change, just blame. Local leaders are trying to do their job. It's time the governor and the state of Illinois does theirs.
Okay, so let's turn first to Brenden. You wrote about this in your column after the governor made his comments up in Chicago. The report cites a lot of factors that account for the tax hikes, but it also lays part of the blame at the feet of state government for not doing enough to keep local taxes under control. Can you explain what the state's role is in all of this, and is the state really to blame? Or does it carry part of the blame for the rising property taxes?
Yeah, I mean, Governor Pritzker is correct in that property taxes are imposed locally, but they are intrinsically tied to state policy. I mean, you can't get around that because it kind of starts with the schools. I mean, more than half of a person's property tax bill in Illinois goes to your local school district, and that's because of years of underfunding at the state level of K through 12 schools. And the governor noted that they have started to chip away at that with the evidence-based funding model. They have put in annually now, I believe it's about $2.5 billion higher than it was in 2017 when it was first implemented. But the state is still far from providing adequate funding. I believe the number would be an additional $3 billion, a little bit over that, to get to adequacy. Right now, at the current pace of about $300 million per year increase, the state wouldn't get there until, I believe, about 2039. So it's not so local school districts are getting more money from the state, but it's hardly a number that I guess makes them completely whole. And so you still find school districts needing to fill in the gaps, and the easiest way for them to do that is through local property taxes. But beyond that, I mean, there are other ways that the state has an impact on property taxes. I mean, the report noted that the state does have a property tax cap law on the books, known as PTEL, but has a lot of holes in it. Probably the biggest one is that home rule municipalities are exempt, so they are not subject to those requirements. There's also loopholes for closed TIF districts, and some other exclusions there that make it easier for a lot of local governments to get around those caps. And then just something that every year we hear it down in Springfield when the Illinois Municipal League has their big lobby day. They're always fighting to restore that their share of the local government distributive fund. It used to be 10% of the income tax went to local governments. That hasn't been the case now for about a decade and a half. It's now closer to about 6.5, I would say. But the governor has proposed a reduction of that, even in his current fiscal year budget proposal. So they would argue that you're placing additional mandates on us and you're giving us less funding to fulfill those requirements. So they have to go back to the local taxpayers to help fund some of those things. And then of course pensions. I mean, just as the state is upping its pension payments every year, local governments, especially for public safety pensions, police and fire, have to increase funding every year to get to, I believe it's 90% funded by 2040 is the requirement for locals. I'll have to double check that. But either way, just as the ramp is going up at the state level, it's going up at the local level. So you take all that into consideration, and it makes it very hard to contain property tax rate growth, because there are so many obligations that local governments have to pay for, and frankly the state has not stepped up in the way, again, beyond the EBF, I guess to halt property taxes and even started about talking about reducing them.
Yeah, I guess if you're talking about school districts being underfunded for years, we're starting to put in more money, or we have been for close to a decade now, each year ramping up the amount of money that the state puts in. But that money has been going to make up for previous underfunding. They're not using that money to buy down property tax cuts in the future. Is that essentially it?
Yeah, I think that would be an accurate summation. I mean, the state is making up for a lot of lost time, and even now, I mean, property taxes still make up the bulk of local school funding. So we're not really close yet to really where the state would have, where we're at that shift of primary responsibility going to the state. And also one thing I think should be noted too is that, the governor mentioned EBF. Well, last year, and I believe this year, he also did not include the $50 million that was set aside for property tax rebates under EBF. So he includes the funding for schools, but not for the property tax rebates. So that should be worth noting too as we talk about this property tax issue.
And that was $50 million each year that is used for property tax relief grants to select school districts, high tax districts, in order to help buy down small tax cuts in those particular districts. It's not a statewide thing, and that's like $50 million in relief out of $25 billion in total property taxes collected statewide for schools. So it was never a really big program to begin with. But I want to turn to Ben now, because you wrote about the Republicans' reaction to this, and they had that news conference later in the week. What are their policy proposals? I mean, what do they propose doing about it? And what other kinds of options does the state have to hold down local property taxes?
Yeah, their big thing is something has to be done about this whole situation. And their complaint is Democrats have completely neglected to do anything about property taxes, especially under Governor Pritzker. So they're looking at some pretty specific stuff. One of them would be basically establishing a statewide program that school districts can tap into that would give grant funding out for property tax relief. The condition to that, and the way I think property tax relief would really be created, is they would have to limit their levies in order to receive that grant. So it's one of those things where I think strings get attached to it and the grants go out. And I think one of the big things that they're trying to address here is kind of what the governor is talking about in some ways, and that if the school districts are going to receive more funding, they got to do something to lower their tax levy in exchange for more money from the state. Another idea that they have is basically when these local governments they have bonds for a capital project or something like that. And when those bonds and the project have been used up, they don't want any of that extra bond money going to some other new project. They say that's just, it's and on one hand, it's kind of going against the will of the voters, where voters likely approved some of those bonds for a specific project. They don't want that money that voters approved for one thing to be going towards a whole nother thing. So they want to limit that, which they think could help bring property taxes down in some way too, because a municipality would have to go back to voters in order to get approved for more bonds to do another project. So those are just kind of some of the things that they're looking at. One question I asked in that news conference was, what about these TIF districts, which the Cook County report shows kind of, eating up a lot of money, and it's increasing rapidly. And Republicans said they're kind of into it.
Yeah, and for people who aren't familiar with that, they're tax increment financing districts, where basically if you develop a project within a certain area, the increased taxes that would be generated because of the increased value that comes from the development is used to pay for the development. It doesn't go to the local governments the way other taxes would. And so the report kind of pointed out there's been an explosion of TIF districts. And some people say that just means other people have to pick up a larger share of the property tax burden.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that kind of goes along with this TIF district conversation is, this Bears Stadium thing that we're talking about. The big concern there is it's going to lead to more rising property taxes in suburban Cook County, where we this report shows us big issues. So I think these are some of the conversations that Republicans are looking to have, is some of these specific things, but also more broadly here, as we talk about the Bears, how are state lawmakers passing legislation to ensure that the taxpayers ultimately aren't going to be the ones paying a much higher bill because some business got a tax break in order to carry out their project.
Brenden, I want to go back to you about one of the other proposals that's been on the table. Former Governor Pat Quinn has been out on the road pushing his proposal for a constitutional amendment for a so-called millionaire's tax. Can you tell us what that is, and what does Governor Pritzker have to say about it in terms of property tax relief?
Yeah, so the idea is basically imposing a 3% surcharge on income over $1 million. As we all know, Illinois has a flat income tax rate right now of 4.95%, which means that no matter if you're a billionaire or you're making minimum wage, you're paying the same tax rate. This would try to recoup revenue for the state from some of its highest earners, and it mirrors a advisory referendum that was on the ballot in 2024 that got 61% approval from the voters. And as it's proposed, the proponents suggest using that money for property tax relief, or some have suggested using it for K through 12 education. And as we just talked about, those issues are kind of intertwined. This has been done a few other places, most recently in Massachusetts and in Washington, California, and it's kind of become a bit of a populist measure, and perhaps even more so now with some of the changes coming at the federal level from the Trump administration, where we saw under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, changes to tax policy that disproportionately benefit the wealthy. At the same time, there's a slashing of social spending that states rely on to balance their budgets. And so, this could be a way for the state of Illinois to get some of that money back. And a study actually came out from a left-leaning think tank this week that showed that this tax could generate up to $4.2 billion by 2030. And that money could be used for obviously a lot of things. They looked at perhaps property tax relief or again, getting that full funding for K through 12 schools. So the governor was asked about the idea though earlier this week, and he said that, yeah, this is an idea that could, perhaps put a dent in property taxes. And again, the study showed that, if you put it all to property tax relief, you could cut property tax rates by up to 20% for those who claim homestead exemptions, which basically means you're living in the state, you're not some out of state, landowner. This would be the people that live in Illinois. So the governor said, yeah, it could. But obviously, when local governments are imposing, I believe the latest is like 37 billion dollars worth of property taxes. 3 or 4 billion dollars of new money is just going to be a dent that, you still have to do other things to really tackle that issue. Now, it should be noted that the governor was the main proponent of the so-called fair tax back in 2020, which I would say is probably a cousin to this effort. It would have set a rate structure, graduated rate structure, and that was rejected by the voters. This one would be, again, maybe a little easier to understand because I think everyone gets what a millionaire's tax would do. But the governor has basically said it's not a huge priority of his for this session. That said, I mean, it's not just Pat Quinn that's pushing this, but House Speaker Emmanuel Chris Welch is trying to push it in the legislature. And, again, we got about a month until the deadline to place a constitutional amendment on the ballot. It just takes super majorities in the House and the Senate. The governor's not really involved in that way. So if he can get it through the House and President Harmon brings it up in the Senate, it could be on the ballot. I think that it's just a question of do Democrats want another bite at the apple after the last effort? Again, a little bit different, but kind of a similar concept. Failed, kind of flamed out in 2020.
Okay, Ben, Republicans also called out Governor Pritzker for part of his budget proposal this year, which includes some additional revenues from a variety of sources, including a social media tax or the so-called TikTok tax. Any movement in the legislature so far? Are you seeing any momentum building either for or against those ideas?
No, I'm not really seeing anything one way or another, but I think maybe what the important context here is that we can talk about is how lawmakers could approach considering this tax change. From the Republican perspective, this is just another tax on more businesses that is going to drive businesses and residents out of the state of Illinois, is the way they put it. They believe the governor has just been entirely irresponsible on the tax front and in his tenure, is not doing anything to lower the tax burden. They talked about the property tax issue, and this is to them, an extension of that and a failure to consider any tax reform. On the Democrat side, I think they're going to be kind of looking at this from a couple different angles. One thing I think they want to do is make sure they pass a legal tax on the social media companies. There are some questions whether a tax on social media companies based on how many users they have in the state is legal. There is a challenge in the city of Chicago right now to their ordinance, which does the same thing that the governor has proposed. It's usually not good practice for state lawmakers to pass a revenue source, balance a budget on it, and then find out later that it's illegal and end up losing the revenue for that. So I think that's one thing they're going to closely consider as to whether they want to move forward with this social media tax or not. And I think some of the other considerations will also just be political, such as, these are taxes on a big business. Meta's not the most popular company in the world out there. Democrats can score political points for instituting a tax on a big corporation like that in this climate.
Okay, and finally, I wanted to bring up some late breaking news. As we're recording this on Friday afternoon, unionized faculty at the University of Illinois Springfield have gone out on strike. Ben, you were just out there at the picket lines earlier today. What can you tell us?
Yeah, this is the first strike by faculty at an Illinois state-run university since 2023, when 3 universities ended up on strike at the same time. This is the first at UIS since 2017. And this year, the issue for tenured and tenured track faculty is that the raises they're getting are not enough. Professors under this group come in making $55,000 as their minimum salary to start. The union wants to see an $11,000 raise to that. UIS is only offering, I believe it was a $2,000 raise, so there's a pretty big gap there. And then as far as annual cost of living adjustments go, the university is only offering a 1% increase effective basically starting now and not dating it back to when this contract expired in August. Then the rest of the raises would be governed by university policy across the U of I system, which are not as high as the union is looking for. The union is looking for about a 3% increase right now that would be backdated to August when the contract expired. They're also looking for 6% over the next 2 years after this year. So there seems to be a pretty wide gap in these salary considerations here. Conversations have been going on for a long time, but it's not really clear where they stand. They had a 10-hour bargaining session on Thursday and ended up on strike here on Friday morning. There are no, at least as of today, as of this afternoon, there was no new bargaining session scheduled. So it seems like they're a bit of a ways off on their distance between each other right now.
Well, we're sitting here in early April. Finals will be coming up in May and graduation in May. Any chance that this strike could interfere with the end of classes and possibly, graduation in the spring?
Yeah, it's very hard to tell, and I asked about that. From the union's perspective, they said if students are worried, they have a decent right to be worried about it. From the university's perspective, I think not every teacher they have is part of this union. So there are quite a few students who are going to be able to continue classes like normal. Some may have fewer classes if their professor decided to be part of this strike. I think it really comes down to how long, this strike were to go on. If it goes on for a week, that's one thing. If this drags on for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, the rest of April, then we're talking about big problems for students, I'm sure.
Okay, well, we'll keep an eye on that as it develops. Meanwhile, that's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. My thanks this week to Brenden Moore and Ben Szalinski for being here. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation, with funding from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Until next time, on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.